Hello, good morning to everyone, and welcome to the second lecture of our Symposium, Cultural Memory of Past Dictatorship, Narratives of Implication in a Global Perspective. This is actually our fifth lecture of the whole series, and the second one taking place on the main day of the conference. And we are very pleased to have here with us in Cork, at University College Cork, Professor Jie-Hyun Lim from Sogang University. So I'm Guido Bartolini, the co-organizer and co-curator of this series of events, together with Dr. Diana Popa from Tallinn University. And just before introducing Professor Lim, I will just thank all the sponsors that made this series of events possible, which is NUI, the National University of Ireland, the ERC, CASiLaC, so the Center for Advanced Studies in Languages and Cultures here at University College Cork, and the ERC project Translating Memory, the Eastern European Past in the Global Arena, which was founded by the European Research Council under the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Program. Okay, without further ado, I'm very glad to introduce Professor Lim, which actually made something quite amazing. I would say that he transformed himself this fully online event in a hybrid conference by choosing to come from Korea here to be with us and follow the whole event. And so that was fantastic. And so I already thank you, Professor, for that. So Jie-Hyun Lim is a global historian and scholar of memory with a regional focus on Eastern Europe and East Asia, who is working at Sogang University in Seoul, South Korea, where he's also the director of the Critical and Global Studies Institute. Within the Institute, he's curating the project Mnemonic Solidarity, Colonialism, War, and Genocide in the Global Memory Space, which is a multi-year transdisciplinary international research project launched in 2017 that focuses on the deterritorialization of mnemonic discourses on colonialism, war, and genocide since World War II, and seeks to trace the history of global memory formation and its influence on people's lives. Professor Lim has published extensively on the memory of mass dictatorships, and his most recent publications include Global East, Remembering, Imagining, and Mobilizing with Columbia University Press, and Mnemonic Solidarity, Global Interventions, published with Palgrave Macmillan and co-edited with Yves Rosenhaft. So without further ado, I'm just going to share your presentation, and then I leave the floor to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Guido and Diana, for having me. Still I have a little bit doubt if Ireland is the right place to talk about dictatorship, especially contemporary Ireland. I'm sort of a lucky historian in that I have experienced two different types of dictatorships. Anti-communist right-wing developmental dictatorship in South Korea while I was a student, and also while I was working on Poland. It actually was immediately after the fall of the really existing socialism, but I could really meet the residues of the existing socialism in Poland. Also on the northern part of Korean Peninsula, we still have some very strange amalgam of a communist and ultra-nationalist and racist dictatorship. So as a sort of, from the viewpoint of existentialism as a historian, I'm in a very good position to understand what the dictatorship is. But it never means my understanding of dictatorship is right. Today, I'm going to talk about a memory of dictatorship under the title Mass Dictatorship. Its subtitle is Vernacular Memories of Implicated Subjects and Dictatorship from Below. Okay, let me start with some books. On the far left, you can see the Polish book Ofiary Winni. And the subtitle is Nazism and Sovietism versus Świadomości historycznej, means it's victims or accomplices. And then Nazism and Sovietism in the historical consciousness of Poles. It was published in 1997. Still Poland was in the aftermath of the fall of the communist dictatorship. But at that time, it was really hard for Polish historians to talk about, to raise the question, if we were real victims or accomplices to the communist dictatorship. So when I met this woman in the bookstore, I was shocked by their, this courage to raise that question to Poles who are suffering from the transition from socialism to capitalism, but also where the vivid memories of communist dictatorship still lingers on people's mind. And second one was Dictatorship as Experience. It was a collection of papers based on the conference held in Potsdam, this Institute für die Zeitgeschichtsforschung, and the Institute for Contemporary History in Potsdam is mainly about the GDR. But also in reading these books, it was published in 1999. So almost the same period. And then I found a very interesting concept, dictatorship of consent and welfare dictatorship. While they are, the German historians in Potsdam, while they are analyzing the experience of dictatorship, communist dictatorship in GDR, they coined the term welfare dictatorship and dictatorship of consent to describe what the really existing socialism was. And then in 1999, the same year, even before meeting this book, in Korea, we had a very sharp debate about the project of a building, a memorial institute in memory of late President Park Chung-hee. It provoked large debates among the Korean historians and intellectuals, but contrary to our very critical attitude, critical view about this monument project, the mass in the Korean society opinion poll shows that ordinary Koreans are in support of that the memorial project in memory of the late dictator Park Chung-hee. So it suddenly, made me rethink about what the dictatorship is. Our common sense of dictatorship is that dictatorship is a system where a handful of bad guys, they deprived the political power of the existing institutions, and they are ruling over the majority of innocent people through the coercion and oppression and power and all the oppressing institutions like Gestapo or NKVD or secret police and so on. But suddenly this experience tells me, no, Jie-Hyun, this really existing dictatorship was a bit different from your common sense. So I began to rethink of what the dictatorship is. And then it was the beginning of my project of mass dictatorship.
Maybe let's speak.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, no, it's too much.
Oh. Okay. So this is a series of mass dictatorship published at Palgrave, and my series of mass dictatorship includes really different types of dictatorships, not only in Europe, but also in Asia, and the communist dictatorship, total war system in Japan, and development dictatorship in South Korea, and Kim Il-sungism in North Korea, also Maoism, and Nazism, fascism, and also Stalinism, and also some regimes in the Eastern Europe, the so-called popular democracy regimes in Poland. Actually, the idea of mass dictatorship is come from my own experience in meeting with two different opposing dictatorships in South Korea and People's Poland. So the book Ofiary Winnie, and also we knew that what the Lustraccia debates in Eastern Europe, right? And Adam Michnik and Václav Havel, who were the most, I think, the authentic dissidents to the communist regime, but they were against Lustraccia because according to Havel, citing Havel, actually he said that dividing line between victims and perpetrators run through every individual. So, this is a very, very intuitive wording about the ordinary people's lives, not people's lives, everyday lives in the communist regime. So it was also shocking to me and really eye-opening the wording by Adam Michnik and the Václav Havel. And also I talked about Park Chung-hee's project. And then, when I began to talk about mass dictatorship, my former colleagues who are very much left-wing, critical intellectuals in South Korea, they began to attack me. Jie-Hyun, our innocent people, workers and peasants could not support that morally bad dictatorship, anti-communist dictatorship. And in Poland, it was a anti-communist right-wing dissident. Jie-Hyun, no, never ever. We ordinary Poles who were victims by the communist regime, they never ever supported the communist regime. So I could find a very uncanny and very weird alliance of the left-wing intellectuals in South Korea and ultra right-wing anti-communists in Poland who stands against the idea of mass dictatorship. No, never ever our ordinary people could ever support that sort of very bad, evil, devil, dictatorial regimes. Then, it was a sort of, how can I say, the first step for me to overcome the Manichaean demonology in the Cold War era. So, I mean, in our understanding of dictatorship, left-wing dictatorship and right-wing dictatorship was based on the basically Manichaean demonology. So one of my friends, who is also so-called left-wing intellectual and who is working on Maoist China, I said, oh, Jie-Hyun, yes, perhaps we can say Maoism or Kim Il-sungism is a mass dictatorship, but I cannot forgive you if you say that Park Chung-hee was a mass dictatorship, right? And also for the Polish right-wing anti-communist intellectuals, oh yes, Park Chung-hee, your developmental dictatorship had achieved certain, great advance in economic terms, but our communist, the dictatorship was terrible. So you cannot say mass dictatorship about communist regime in Poland, but you can say about mass dictatorship in South Korea. So I was really squeezed between left-wing intellectuals in South Korea and right-wing intellectuals in People's Poland. So when I organized the first international conference on mass dictatorship, I invited a couple of Polish sociologists who used the term of adaptation to describe how the ordinary people really reacted to the communist regime's different projects and policies. And they said to me in Seoul, in my conference, it's very, very difficult to talk about mass dictatorship in People's Poland, because, they would attack me very, very, very sharply. So it was a really interesting experience for me to understand dictatorship in the transnational context and transnational perspectives. That's the beginning of dictatorship. Oh, okay. And then, let me start with, I just start with a very simple question about dictatorship. If majority of the people support dictatorship, is it democracy or dictatorship? Right? If majority of people support dictatorship, we could find such a phenomenon quite often. So I found that no dictator talked of his regime as a dictatorship. Our own way of democracy, right? Or people's democracy in communist regime, national democracy. So all the dictatorship actually, wore the costume of democracy on one's own way. And in a sense, it has a grain of truth when they are talking about our own democracy compared to the Western democracy or egoistic democracy or atomic democracy. Our democracy is a real communitarian democracy or Gemeinschaft democracy and something like that. So we could find this very interesting things. So I told that we need to differentiate between despotism and dictatorship. Yes, despotism is in the pre-modern society. For example, a Franco regime, despotismo moderno, is a typical alliance of conservatives and the military among the elite group without mass involvement. But as far as the fascism and Nazism, Stalinism and developmental dictatorship and Maoism, even Kim Il-sungism is concerned, it is heavily based on the mass voluntary self-mobilization or self-participation and something like that. So mass dictatorship is a very much modern regime, very much modernist regime compared to the despotism was a pre-modern or the early modern regime. So based on all the mass dictatorship, it tried to recruit or try to mobilize the social political engineering of the modern state system to command the voluntary mobilization and participation of the masses. It is very intriguing. If you have a look at the biographies of all the communist leaders of communist regime, you can find that all of these guys actually studied engineering at the university level. If the Gorbachev was the only exceptional one and he destroyed communist system, means that communist leaders are really concerned about the engineering of the system. And so actually it was, in the name of for the proletariat, they tried to establish their own social political engineering of the system, which actually mobilize and even exploit the proletariat in the name of the proletariat, by the proletariat, for the proletariat. So it's a dictatorship from below. And then I found when I began to read some books about these biographies, and then there is certain lineage or a genealogy of mass dictatorship, which can be traced back even 19th century. Alexis Tocqueville, through his travel to United States, he epitomized American democracy, tyranny through masses. So I think that he predicted Trumpism, in a sense already, And then the Mao Zedong himself talked that this is a dictatorship by the masses. So it's a democracy. It's different from the Western democracy, but a real true democracy. And these East European, the communist regimes define themselves as people's democracy, right? So proletarian dictatorship and the people's democracy and head and tail of the same coin. And also Jakob Telman, who is a Polish Jew, and the Shlomo Avineri and the I can't remember his name. Recently he passed away, the Israeli historian working on the French conservatives and French. Oh, okay. Anyway, so Jakob Telman already in 1960s wrote a book, Totalitarian Democracy. He defined the Jacobean democracy or Jacobianism as a totalitarian democracy. And Carl Schmitt, yes, Carl Schmitt, he already used sovereign dictatorship in advocacy of Nazism. And also, it's a very intriguing fact that late dictator in South Korea, Park Chung-hee, he sent his political aides to Carl Schmitt. He was already in late 80s, and these Korean political scientists who tried to legitimize Park Chung-hee's constitutional coup of 1972, they asked Carl Schmitt, how can we define this as a sort of democracy? So this hidden history, in a sense, shows that, dictatorship is not that simple, and the dictators are really concerned about getting support from below. And also people, to some extent, ordinary people responded to that invitation, sort of with some, sometimes enthusiastically and sometimes, lukewarmly, but anyway, we can see the people's rather positive reaction, positive responses to the invitation by the dictatorship. And so this intuition that a people's democracy or national sovereignty and the people's sovereignty even, and Jacobianism is a root of today's contemporary mass dictatorship, tells me that this, a conventional dichotomy of the Western democracy versus non-Western dictatorship is also problematic, especially from the post-colonial perspectives. And even Western democracy domestically can be democratic. But on the other hand, they had a terrible, brutal colonial policies outside their own state. So Western democracy has been always combined with the colonial brutality. And non-Western dictatorship always try to imitate Western democracy in a sense, right? But this is more. I mean, this is a really difficult question, but it needs we need to consider, for example, how to provincialize Europe from the viewpoint of dictatorship regime, comparative studies of dictatorship. But one thing clearly we can say is that mass dictatorship is not a deviation or aberration from the normal path of development, but as a transnational formation of modernity. So mass dictatorship has always proposed to establish their own modernity regime, or in pursuing modernization, pursuing modernity. So democracy and dictatorship can be, located in the same problem space of modernity. So without modernity, without understanding modernity, we cannot really understand the democracy and dictatorship as a pair. So I mean that colonial violence, fascist atrocities, Holocaust, and post-colonial genocides, in a sense, can be understood within a continuum. So even Nazism, I think Nazism, especially from the viewpoint of Eastern Europe, I think Nazism was a project to colonize Slavic world and turning imperialism upside down and treating Europeans as Africans. And we know that the Ostforschung in Germany, Eastern studies actually, they called Polish studies Ostforschung in Germany, right? Eastern studies. And in Poland, the German studies was called Studia Zachodnie, means Western studies. So, the Orientalism as a discursive regime that the Edward Said very clearly explicated in his Orientalism, I think that also can be to some extent applied to the understanding this Ostforschung or German studies, Polish studies, and a sort of chain of the discursive chain of Orientalism, East and West, is going eastwards. For example, two poles. Russia was a terrible East, and Ukraine was the East, right? While we pose, we are West, right? Still, you can see nowadays. So we shouldn't call the Poland or Czechoslovakia or Hungary as Eastern Europe. It's Central Europe, right? or Central Eastern Europe at worst. I mean, so these sort of things also need to be considered in our understanding of dictatorship. And so mass dictatorship is transnational formation of modernity, I think. So we can see the very interesting oxymoron metaphors. Retroactive modernity and modernism against modernity, anti-Western westernization, anti-modern modernization, Gemeinschaft capitalism. All these rhetorics, oxymoron metaphors were used in describing these mass dictatorships in the non-West countries, Nazism, fascism, and so on. Means that I think that there is a certain hidden desire among those historians who use those oxymoron metaphors, is that modernity is an inevitable stage of human development. So in a sense, a step toward modernity is a good thing for them. But on the other hand, they could not endorse those dictatorial regimes. That's why they had to put these oxymoron metaphors like retroactive modernism and so on and so on. They could not, deny that those regimes, dictatorial regimes, really tried hard to achieve certain modernization or drive toward modernity. So, and also from the viewpoint of East Asia or the former colonies, the mass dictatorship was driven by two locomotives. The one is the desire for the colonizing power. We Koreans could have colonized Japan instead of being colonized by the Japan. So that desire for the colonizing power and the fear of being colonized. If we don't hurry modernization in a very short period, we could be colonized again by our powerful labors. So this desire for the colonialism and the fear of being colonized, in a sense of two locomotives of mass dictatorship, we can find in Nazism and fascism, Corradini's, very famous dichotomy of the bourgeois nation versus proletarian nation. But that Corradini's, dichotomy of bourgeois nation versus proletarian nation can be found among colonial Marxists quite often. So I think that this is today's dependent theory. In a sense, when I read Corradini for the first time, oh my God, this guy is a really harbinger of today's dependency theory, right? This bourgeois nation versus proletarian nation. So we, as an intellectual or politician in the proletarian nation, we need to make in bourgeoisie our proletarian nation to win the competition with the bourgeois nations. So this sort of things can be found in Enrico Corradini. Lee Sun-tang is a Korean Marxist. And then and also Subhas Chandra Bose, this Indian Marxist from Bengal, and Kemal Atatürk, Sun Yat-sen, and Sukarno Ho Chi Minh, really from the bundle of very famous, world famous, so-called a third world, intellectuals and revolutionaries, we could find this Enrico Corradini's dichotomy of bourgeois nation versus proletarian nation. Oh, still I have some time, right? Yes. And also the other illusion about or delusion about the fascism or dictatorship is that dictatorship is based exclusively on oppression and power, coercion, and so on. But we have really lots of examples to show that how even the dictatorial regimes try to use governmentality, try to achieve certain governmentality through which they could make a certain self-mobilization among the masses to get the support from below. So I think that we can say fascist, for example, fascist governmentality or dictatorial governmentality. So, as Mussolini really wished to be the leader, loved by their people, right? His people. And I think this is a very literary expression of this fascist governmentality. Now, I don't want to rule over these people just by force and coercion. I want to be loved by them, and they truly love me. And this is, then how can this love be possible? I think the internal coercion, by internalizing coercion. So I think that I can't remember his name. I think he's an American political philosopher. He once explicitly wrote that liberal democracy is the most refined form of totalitarianism, because liberal democracy succeeds very often in making internal coercion by structuring thought and feeling among the ordinary people. Just we can compare Churchill with Hitler. Churchill, he demanded only sweat and blood from the British people. But the Hitler, in a sense, he bribed ordinary people. That they could share, the ordinary Germans could share the Jewish goods, the goods that Jews left in the auction, and all the Jewish soldiers, the Nazi soldiers, ordinary soldiers, lots of these photos. Whenever they go back to their hometown for holidays, they used to have double duffel bag full of some goods. And so, that in contrast to Nazism, in a sense, churches did not really guarantee certain material incentive for the ordinary people. So in that sense, total war system in the church's Britain was more effective than the Nazism in a sense. Then why? Because I think it shows the strength of liberal democracy, but from our viewpoint, it shows that liberal democracy is a more sophisticated and refined form of a sort of persuading people into self-mobilization than the mass dictatorship in general. So in that sense, the dividing line between democracy and dictatorship is quite blurring. And then they share a modern state power's desire to make people to be subject voluntarily to the state project and the political powers project. So we can say also colonial governmentality. especially when we are talking about collaborators, colonial collaborators. And then, so this is Pasolini's wording, Mussolini's effort to build up a capillary network of associations with the vast powers of social and cultural persuasion. This epitomizes what a fascist governmentality, looks like. And also we can find a very interesting, the phenomenon of so-called anthropological evolution. Both right-wing and left-wing mass dictatorship regimes try to perform anthropological evolution by making new men, Homo fascistus, Homo sovieticus, as the totalitarian anthropological evolutionary efforts. And so Stanov, right? And all the hero workers and model citizens. In all the mass dictatorship regime, we can find this sort of anthropological evolution. And very recently, North Korea launched a very strange campaign. Let's learn from I think this is 14 years old boy. He sacrificed himself in order to save portraits of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il in the flood. And he died. And we don't know how he died actually, right? But this North Korean regime now propagandized very vastly. Let's learn from this guy and this 14 years old boy, dare to lose his own life in order to save the portraits of our great leaders. So this sort of things is, yes, North Korea is a little bit weird country, but at least within the continuum of this anthropological evolution that all mass dictatorship has tried. And even, in Cuba, immediately after the revolution, Castro coined the term of, we need a new man. Let's make a new man. And also in the British Guinea, they invited even North Korean mass game organizers, performers, to let the British Guinean people learn how to perform mass game, because these guys thought that, these dictators thought that, our people are not disciplined at all. So we need to discipline our people by performing mass game organized by North Korean experts. This was early 1980s. So that sort of examples can be found quite well. And this is also, I think, in a sense, can be understood from the viewpoint of a governmentality of mass dictatorship. So I think that we have a really multi-layered experience in the mass dictatorship spanning internalized cause and forced consent, passive conformity, voluntary consensus, resistance, built-in hegemony, dominant pregnant with resistance, and also actually, how can I say, some certain victim and accomplices are intermingled within one individual in everyday lives. So it's really hard, even it is much more complicated than implicated subject itself. They were implicated, but also they tried to be implicated, or they forced to be implicated. But for them, for the ordinary people, the most important was that, okay, let us live our everyday lives peacefully and some in a satisfactory way.
Like 5-6 minutes.
Okay. And then also from the ideological viewpoint, nationalization of masses is also quite commonly found phenomenon. It's Carl Schmitt, advocacy of Nazism, as quote, anti-liberal, but not necessarily anti-democratic, unquote. It's Carl Schmitt even cited Jacobin Barrère, and then the Jacobin dictatorship means that Barrère, he as a member of National Convention, he justified Jacobin dictatorship by saying that the nation is exercising dictatorship over itself. Means that it is democracy, because a nation exercising dictatorship over itself, and the nation is the entity which has the supreme sovereignty, right? So it has a constitutional power. So nobody can really regulate nations' will. So in the name of nation's will, it has been actually legitimized. And George Moss, so when I read this very shocking sentence by George Moss first time, but then later I could become, understand what he means. George Moss quotes, Robespierre would have felt at home in the Nazis' mass rally. It's really shocking at first, but now I can understand what he means by this very much revealing sentence. And then Eugene Weber, also a great historian, and he said, no, Nazism looks much like the Jacobinism of our time. So it means that the mass dictatorship can be understood in the continuity of this French Revolution and Jacobinites, the principle of national sovereignty or people's sovereignty and something like that. And also Carl Schmitt really formulated this sort of transition of Jacobinite idea of democracy into the idealization of mass dictatorship in the 20th century, and fear to the enemies of the people, a feeling of relief among national comrades. And so in the mass dictatorship regimes, we can find really very strong egalitarian ideology among national comrades, right? Of course, only among national comrades, not non-national comrades. So then in a sense, it gives me an idea that, yes, there was terrible coercion and then, a terrible terror against the people, but the people was chosen minority as a target with the consent of the masses. For example, if I were a certain normal South Korean worker who has a very strong anti-communist ideology and who felt a certain necessity of modernizing Korean nation very quickly under the leadership of Park Chung-hee, I could have felt at home and very safe under the dictatorial regime. But if I were a communist, perhaps that the situation could have looked totally differently. Same to Jews in Germany, or same to homosexuals, or Romanis and the communists in Nazi regime. But if one really feels a Aryan authenticity, and I'm an Aryan, and yes, I don't like a cohabitation with the Jews. I like the Judenfrei Deutschland, and then they could have felt totally different. So the opinion poll after the Second World War in 1949, 48, 51 in West Germany shows clearly more than half of the population in West Germany, at that time West Germany, had just remembered that the most peaceful and most safe and the most, the satisfactory time for them was the period between 1933 and 1939. And is this intriguing to show how the ordinary people actually had lived their everyday lives under the mass dictatorship? So finally, I think that as far as the implicated subject is concerned, we need to think of agency and subjectivity in everyday life of the mass dictatorship. So there was a self-mobilization always persuaded people, and they supported mass dictatorship, but also very often that self-mobilization was overlapping self-energization or self-empowerment. And for example, we have a very interesting oral history, records of the countryside women who are not educated at all and who had been totally marginalized, but when they were summoned to the new village movement leaders, suddenly they felt, my God, the public sphere for the first time invited me to the public sphere. And then I felt being a very important person for our country. And then so there was a self-mobilization, but also it was a way to achieve self-empowerment among those people. So self-mobilization and self-energization are overlapping. Same way, collusion and evasion overlapping, and also victims and accomplices overlapping. So multiple gray areas of neither nor actions and choices. So I mean that in my understanding, the reality of everyday lives under the mass dictatorship is more complicated than the implicated subject can hint to us for today's understanding. Yeah, I'll finish. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Professor Lim. Thank you. That was fantastic. I will just stop the screen share. Yes. So that was very excellent. And I think it was exactly the kind of lecture that can inspire us all and let us think about dictatorship in a very transnational and global perspective, a bit as the event aim to do. So you touch upon so many points, which also includes the relationship between democracy and dictatorship through a more broader reflection on power, the relationship between the West and the East. So I'm sure that there are going to be lots of questions, but as a chair that I'm here, I'm very honored to ask the first one and to try to start from your overall understanding of dictatorship as a mass phenomenon that, as you said, I think is brilliantly, it exercises a coercion and violence on a minority, but through the support of a majority of people. And so I think that this, according to me, is a very, I would say correct, but in any case, very important perspective to enforce in our understanding of the past. And so since we think and work on memory, how can we try, to contribute to making, the memory that we have, the memory that we develop, embracing this perspective? Because as you said, there are various strategies to resist to that. You spoke about these adaptation mechanisms, and you can find them on the opposite political spectrum in various countries. But so what is, in your view, as scholars of memory, as activists of memory, what can we do to disseminate more this perspective?
I mean that in the context of the collective memory or social memory of past dictatorship, the real problem is victimhood. Everyone says, "Oh, we were victimized by the dictatorial regimes," and then although they were implicated subjects and they supported dictatorial regimes in different ways, but very often they are hiding behind a screen memory of victimhood. I mean, for example, even these Laudansky brothers who were killers of Jews in Jedwabne. When the Anna Bikont, a Gazeta Wyborcza, the journalist, had an interview with these Laudansky brothers in 2001 or 2, and that this guy said that, as you see, like all the Poles, we were victims by the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, and then by the people's, the Ludowa Polska, the People's Democrats in Poland. And actually, quite really, in Poland, we call it as small fishes who can escape all the nets. So who has been always collaborators by turning from the pro-Nazi collaborators, pro-Soviet Union collaborators, and pro-Polish national communist collaborators. And nowadays they really pretend to be Democrats and so on. So in this sense, victimhood, collective victimhood, right? Regardless of one's own individual responsibility or one's own individual action, they are hiding. So this is one of the things, and the sort of, how can I, self-criticism and the recognizing their own, involvement, implication, I think is very important. That's why I like really the implicated subject, although it has its own limits in some sense, but.
Yes, so yeah. Thanks. I'm sure, you could add more things, but let's keep it for now. And because I see there are questions from the floor. So Mina is the first one who raised their hand. Please, Mina.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the wonderful talk. A lot of excellent ideas to digest. So I'm just going to ask two sort of one clarifying question and then one comment, actually. So I was thinking about the oxymoronic metaphors. It was quite interesting there. You mentioned the examples, anti-Western, Westernization. Sorry, seagulls.
Yeah. Seagulls.
And anti-modern modernization. Could you say a little bit more about that? And then another thing that I really I thought that it was excellent also towards the end of your presentation when you talked about the people's subjective dimensions and the desire, how you can basically inflict pain on someone and just say that that's you're just serving your country while you can get some libidinal payoff. So basically that's actually what I was thinking. It's the same thing, how it comes close to what Slavoj Zizek says about banality of evil. He rereads Hannah Arendt's notion of banality and evil and says that there's a dimension lacking there, that it's not just thoughtlessness, it's actually when you are inserting pain on other people, you can sort of hide behind the law or behind the big brother and say like, oh, I'm just doing my duty here, but at the same time, you're torturing people and potentially you get away with that sort of like sadistic impulses. Not that it necessarily relates to everyone, but there's that chance. So that was really interesting. But yes, so if you could say a little bit about the oxymoronic metaphors. Thanks.
Okay, I mean the anti-Western westernization or anti-modern modernization is the term coined by the Orientalists in Soviet Union in 1970s when they were talking, they were analyzing about the so-called socialisms in Africa and the Middle East and the Central Asia. And in a sense, I could feel these Moscow Orientalists had a sort of feeling of superiority to those third world or peripheral socialists. But on the other hand, also it is true that these intellectuals like Sun Yat-sen and the Sukarno and all these guys really took the socialism not as an ideology of emancipation, but as an ideology of mobilization. So in order to mobilize people and workers and peasants to the modernization project, they just appeal to socialism and they appropriate socialism from the ideology of emancipation to the ideology of mobilization. And Kim Il-sung and Mao Zedong and all this, if you read all these so-called third world socialist leaders, you can see that their ideas are full of mobilization rather than emancipation. So anti-modern modernization means that, okay, we can modernize our people and to win competition with the colonial powers through the rapid modernization. But when these guys try to modernize their own countries, colonies, via the ways that colonialist power imposed, they have a certain emotional resistance about it. But socialism and especially Leninist, this adaptation of socialism, Marxism into the ideology of modernization in the backward countries, they could see that, oh, this is really the solution to our dilemma. On the one hand, we really hated colonialist way of development, but we had to modernize our country in order to defeat the colonialist power. But socialism was a totally sort of third alternative to those guys. So anti-modern modernization, anti-Western westernization can be found among those socialist leaders in the peripheral countries. And as for the banality, I think that the Hannah Arendt, in a sense, was cheated by Eichmann. I think 10 years ago there was a certain exhibition in the Centre de Shoah in Paris, and the what's the name of that guy? The Fish syndrome.
Rousseau.
Yeah, Henri Rousseau was the actually organizer of that exhibition. I had an interview with Henri at that time, and then they revealed lots of these document papers that Eichmann instructed his lawyers to defend himself like that. And even Eichmann, he tried to write a novel. There is a manuscript of his novel, right? He's a very, very, cunning guy. But the Hannah Arendt was, she was too really, I mean, she was loading this Aihiman, so she could not find very cunningness from Aihiman. So I would say, I would agree to a Zygmunt Bauman's rationality of evil, more than banality of evil. So through the concept of rationality of evil, I think that then we can really understand how the Nazism really tried to make a self-mobilization system through the mobilizing masses from below, or use the term of national comrade, right? And also the Orientalist discourses towards Poland and Eastern neighbors. Even German specialists of forestology, forests, they worked in Africa, and these guys came to Poland, and they used the term of Urwald. So forest in Eastern Europe wasn't Urwald like in forest in Africa. So these sort of things can be still found. I think this. I'm still yes. Banality of evil is a very important concept through which we can really self-reflect, right? Reflect as critically on ourselves, but on the other hand, also from the viewpoint of mass dictatorship regime, I think the rationality of evil also is a very interesting concept through which we can really understand this.
I think it's an important reflection.
Thank you very much.
There is another question, and meanwhile, Diana, if you can also check the chat, because from here is more complicated. So I saw that Leida Ruvina has a question, please, Leida.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, just one, I will just relate, didn't intend to, but I will relate with the banality of evil. Just a short reflection on the role that linguistics can have in making us understand better concepts that regard reality, politics, and so on. Since Italian is my third language, I was sure that staccanovista, in Italian, staccare means to unplug. And I was sure that someone that never stops working is someone that never is unplugged from working.
Oh, really?
So when I read that Stakhanovista is actually the name of a Russian hero of work, I know now, but still in my mind, Stakhanovista is someone who never is unplugged from working, related to the Italian word staccare. And I was thinking about this, about the term rule of law. We all agree that the rule of law in the Western democracy means accountability under the law of both community and individuals, as well as the government. The only problem is that also in a dictatorship, there is the rule of law. The only problem is the law. There is, and I'm just talking about from an Albanian perspective, the Albanian communism, and I'm sorry, there is no sign of Balkan war crimes or authoritarian cases so far, but just if I can give this contribution. In the Albanian communism, there was little ordinary crime. There was almost no organized crime. People neither knew what organized crime was. And this is very different from authoritarian government in South America, for example. The rule of law actually still today, as well as in Italy, is associated with a period where indeed there was fascism or communism, like in Mussolini time or Enver Hoxha time, but there was little crime, but people had a job, but there were more security, but there were less policemen in the neighborhoods. So all of this came with the globalization. So I think the narrative, the linguistics, the words that we use also can influence our mind. But just to relate it with the concept, so this is not only a matter of propaganda. The rule of law was true. The only problem is that what we mean with law in a democracy is very different with what the law is in authoritarian regimes. We mean the law as something that is also right and just, while in an authoritarian regime, law is only something legal, but from a democratic point of view, it's not legitimated. So from a Weber perspective, it's the difference between legal authority and charismatic authority. And just to my questions about the banality of evil, when Hannah Arendt was so angry that in the very end, we didn't understand, did Eichmann really understood he made something evil? So we kill this guy, we throw his ashes in the sea. But did he really realize that it is not normal to pick up the phone every morning and saying, I'm bringing a train with some people. Have you finished with the other ones? Now I'm bringing the other one. Thank you, goodbye. Turning to your home, being a perfect husband. Someone that related with the books he read in the prison, Lolita, and he said, what a book. Immoral book, immoral story. So he sounds like a normal, decent family man who made an organized system of transporting Hungarian Jews in very few time, in massive way in the concentration camps. And this questions to me is easily explained, talking about the mass support of the people to Hitler regime from a perspective of political communication. The citizens loved Hitler because they saw him only in the narrative that Hitler wanted him to see. He saw Hitler only speaking in public. The civilians in the West, in the East, had never had videos of Auschwitz crimes during the war. We all saw them after the war. And we all have pictures of German citizens living near the concentration camps, visiting the concentration camps after the liberation, and they were shocked by seeing all these corpses and what happened. I don't think it's the same situation now in Russia when you have with internet, with all the censorship of Instagram, but you have YouTube, you have the possibility to see what happened, to see Bucha and to say, this is not true, this is propaganda. I refuse to accept it. So I think in 2022, is it enough to explain the massive support of dictators only with the propaganda? Because I think this was sufficient in the Second World War, when the truth was not mediatic. We knew it after. Or rather, we have to make another reflection of psychology.
We got a few minutes before finishing the session, so I think it's a good question. It's enough. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that you misunderstood what I said. By the using the word of internal coercion, I think that it's totally different from propaganda. So I mean, how did mass dictatorship regime try to persuade people to internalize the virtues and norms and value systems that mass dictatorship regime really want to establish in their country? This was not the propaganda, nor by propaganda, nor by coercion. That just they try to make a certain through the governmentality to make people adapt themselves to the mass dictatorship. That's my point. So it's totally different from propaganda. And also in understanding how this low level of the German civil servants actually contributed to Holocaust. I think that more than banality of evil, we can use the term of mediation of action. It means that, Ahiman said, I never triggered a pistol to Jews. Even I never, hit them. I'm not an anti-Semite. Just as a civil servant, I was subject to the, order from the above, and I made a swear, right? Of being civil servant, it was my obligation. And then the guy's order maker said, oh, no, there's no document. Hitler usually ordered the Holocaust, right? But it means that I just, implied that you might do this and then, but I never ever explicitly ordered them to kill Jews. So responsibility was missing, was lost in the mediation of action. So this is a bureaucracy one. So banality level is very important, but still it is not enough to explain why such a systemic killing has been done, perpetrated, although sometimes these guys are good boys and good uncles. If you read this, the famous popular book of the 101, the police reserve battalion, you can see that just very good fathers and uncles and neighbors, they took part in the killing Jews in Józefów in the Eastern Poland. Why? And there are many explanations, but banality level is not enough to explain, to understand what this. Rather, from the linguistic viewpoint, I think that why Nazis always use the euphemism, right? Final solution, it just means nothing. If we do not know the context of this, why this sort of euphemism actually, in a sense, facilitated ordinary people to take part in such a crime. No, you are not doing this, killing. Just is a final solution for our nation and for our purpose of Judenfrei Deutschland, something like that. So in that sense, I think that in Primo Levi actually wonderfully already analyzed what the language or euphemism works in the concentration camp. So these sort of things also can be used in understanding mass dictatorship in a sense. That's my.
So yeah, thanks a lot. So I'm aware of the time. So I think at this point, I mean, we should all thank Professor Lim for his wonderful lecture and contribution to the symposium. So please join me, you virtually, me in presence, in clapping for this excellent session.
Thank you.